You obey laws that no parliament ever passed and no ruler ever signed. Thomas Aquinas said this was not an illusion. He said reason itself can perceive a moral order written into human nature, and that this order still governs you whether you acknowledge it or not. Every time you feel that something is deeply wrong before you can explain why, you are touching what he called natural law. In this video we will examine the four fundamental inclinations Aquinas identified in the Summa Theologica, and how each still shapes your judgment today. If you want to go deeper into these ideas, subscribe. This is the kind of content we build here, one idea at a time. Between 1265 and 1274, in the great work he left unfinished, Aquinas wrote that natural law is nothing other than the rational creature's participation in the eternal law, a single sentence that has provoked 8 centuries of argument. Most people assume that all law is made, drafted by legislators, imposed by power, and therefore changeable by consensus. Aquinas rejected this at the root, because he distinguished between law that is invented and law that is discovered. In the Summa Theologica, in the section known as the Treatise on Law, he argued that beneath every human statute lies something the human mind does not create but recognizes, the way an eye recognizes light. He called this natural law, and he defined it with unusual precision as the participation of rational beings in the eternal order of things. What this means is that the moral truths you perceive are not projections of your feelings but perceptions of reality, comparable to the way you perceive that a whole is greater than its part. Therefore, for Aquinas, when you judge cruelty to be wrong, you are not expressing a preference, you are reading something already present in the structure of the world. This is why he could claim that even someone who has never opened a book of ethics already possesses the beginnings of moral knowledge. Reason, simply by being reason, grasps certain first principles without instruction. However, this immediately raises a harder question: if such law is written into us, why do we disagree so violently about what is right? Aquinas answered the problem of disagreement by locating a single foundation that no one, in his view, can actually deny. He stated it plainly in the Summa Theologica: good is to be done and pursued, and evil is to be avoided. This is the first precept of natural law, and everything else, he argued, follows from it. The claim sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet its power lies in its inescapability. Because even the person who commits evil does so under the appearance of some good, the thief seeks the good of wealth, the tyrant the good of security. What this reveals is that no one pursues evil as evil, though will always moves towards something perceived as desirable, which means the first principle is not a rule imposed from outside but the very form of how desire works. Aquinas compared this to the first principle of reasoning itself, the principle that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time. Just as all thought presupposes that axiom, all moral action presupposes the pursuit of the good. Therefore the disagreements we observe are not disagreements about the foundation, but about its application in particular cases. But if the foundation is universal, how does it branch into the specific duties we actually feel? From that single root, Aquinas traced the natural law outward through what he called our inclinations, the deep-seated tendencies human beings share with all created things. The first of these, he wrote, is the inclination toward self-preservation, which we hold in common with every living substance. You did not decide to want to continue existing, the wanting precedes any decision. What Aquinas noticed is that this drive is not merely biological but morally significant, because reason recognizes life as a genuine good and therefore derives from this inclination a real precept, that we ought to preserve human life and remove obstacles to it. This is why nearly every legal tradition on earth, independent of religion or culture, prohibits murder. The convergence is not coincidence but evidence, in his framework, of a shared perception. However, Aquinas was careful never to reduce natural law to instinct alone, because animals preserve themselves too, and yet they possess no law. The difference is that reason grasps the good of life, orders it, and can even sacrifice a lesser good for a greater one. What this reveals is that natural law does not oppose our nature but perfects it, and this becomes clearer in the second inclination, which we share not with all life, but with the animals alone. The second inclination Aquinas identified concerns those things nature has taught to all animals, and here he named specifically the union of male and female and the education of offspring. This is the inclination toward the continuation of the species and the care of the young, and it is, he argued, written into us as deeply as the will to survive. The significance for Aquinas is that from this inclination arises an entire structure of obligation, the bond between parents and children, the duty of nurture, and the recognition that human beings are not merely produced but formed. Because the human child, unlike the offspring of most animals, requires years of guidance to become fully rational, the natural law extends beyond mere reproduction into the long labor of education. This is why he treats the family as something rooted in nature itself, not merely in social convention. What this reveals is a claim that unsettles modern assumptions, that certain human bonds are not chosen arrangements but responses to an order we discover. And yet Aquinas did not stop here, because he insisted that these first two inclinations, shared with beasts, cannot alone define what a human being is. The decisive inclination, the one that separates us from every other creature, is the third, and it changes the entire meaning of natural law. The third inclination, Aquinas wrote, belongs to us according to the nature of reason, which is proper to us alone. And he named its objects with striking specificity, that we have a natural inclination to know the truth about God, and to live in society. Here natural law rises above biology entirely, into the distinctly human hunger for understanding and for community. What this means is that the pursuit of truth is not a luxury added on to human life but a demand written into it. The mind that refuses to inquire, that avoids the hardest questions, is for Aquinas acting against its own nature, in the same way that a body starving itself acts against the inclination to preserve life. Therefore intellectual laziness is not neutral, it is a kind of self-betrayal, a failure to become what reason equips us to be. The second object, life in society, is equally decisive, because Aquinas, following Aristotle, held that a human being isolated from others cannot flourish. From this inclination he derives duties of justice, honesty, and the avoidance of harm to those among whom we live. What this reveals is a definition of human nature as fundamentally directed toward truth and toward others, but this raises the sharpest question of all: if these inclinations are universal, why do good people still commit terrible acts? Aquinas was no naive optimist about human nature, and he confronted directly the fact that people who genuinely grasp the first principles still betray it. His answer lies in a distinction between the general principles of natural law, which he held to be the same for all and known to all, and the detailed conclusions we draw from them, which can be obscured. Because the first principle, do good, avoid evil, is self-evident, no one can truly be ignorant of it. However, as reason descends from that principle into particular judgments, error creeps in. Aquinas wrote that the natural law can be blotted out from the human heart either by evil persuasions, or by vicious customs, or by corrupt habits. What this means is that a whole culture can train its members to see something monstrous as ordinary, and the individual raised within it may not perceive the wrong at all. This is why he did not treat conscience as infallible, and why he insisted that reason must be cultivated, not merely trusted. The natural law is a light, but a light can be dimmed by the atmosphere through which it passes. Therefore moral failure is often not the absence of the law within us, but its distortion. And this leads directly to the relationship Aquinas draws between the law written in nature and the laws written by human hands. For Aquinas, human law was never sovereign in itself, because he held that every just human law derives its authority from the natural law. In the Summa Theologica he stated the consequence bluntly: a law that departs from the natural law is no longer a law but a corruption of law. This single sentence has echoed through every argument about justice and legitimacy for 800 years. What this means is that legality and justice are not the same thing. A statute may be passed with full legal procedure and still command what is fundamentally unjust, and when it does, Aquinas argued, it binds the conscience in a wholly different way, if at all. Because the purpose of human law, in his view, is to make citizens good by leading them toward the common good. A law that leads away from it fails at the very thing that makes law law. This is the foundation on which later thinkers built their appeals to a higher standard than mere power. And yet Aquinas was careful, because he did not encourage casual disobedience. He recognized that the disruption of tearing down flawed law can sometimes cause greater harm than the flaw itself. What this reveals is a demand for judgment, not slogans. Which brings us to the faculty by which each of us must render that judgment, conscience itself. Aquinas offered one of the most precise definitions of conscience in the history of philosophy, and it is nothing like the vague inner voice we often imagine. He distinguished between synderesis, the innate habit by which we grasp the first principles of morality, and conscientia, conscience proper, which is an act of reason applying that knowledge to a particular choice. What this means is that conscience is not a feeling at all but a judgment, the mind reasoning from what it knows to be good toward what it must now do. Therefore guilt, properly understood, is not weakness or neurosis, it is reason recognizing that a specific action contradicts a principle you already hold. To feel it is to perceive a genuine discrepancy between your conduct and your knowledge of the good. Aquinas drew a consequence that many find severe. He held that one is bound to follow one's conscience even when it errs, because to act against your own best judgment of the good is always to act against reason itself. However, this places on each person the heavy duty of forming that conscience well, of not letting it be dulled by the corrupt habits he warned about. What this reveals, finally, is that natural law is not a cage but a responsibility, and that responsibility has one concrete demand for your life today. The most practical implication of everything Aquinas argued is deceptively quiet. Your task is not to invent your values but to perceive them clearly, and clarity requires discipline. Because natural law is a light that can be dimmed by custom and habit, the central moral work of a life is keeping that light from being obscured. What this means in ordinary terms is that when you feel the friction of conscience, the small resistance before an action you can sense is wrong, Aquinas would tell you not to explain it away but to examine it. That resistance is reason speaking from principles you already hold. Therefore the practice he implicitly demands is honesty with yourself, the refusal to let convenient stories bury what you actually know to be good. And because he tied the third inclination to the pursuit of truth, the discipline extends to the mind itself, to reading, questioning, and refusing the intellectual laziness that lets the conscience grow coarse. This is why Aquinas devoted a life of relentless inquiry to questions others avoided. What this reveals is that the natural law does not ask you to feel more, but to see more clearly and then to act in accordance with what you see. That is the whole of it, and it is enough to occupy a lifetime. Across four inclinations, the preservation of life, the continuation and care of the young, the pursuit of truth, and the demand of living justly among others, Aquinas built a single claim, that the moral order you obey was not manufactured by any authority but discovered by reason participating in something larger than itself. What this means for you is direct. The friction of conscience is not noise to be silenced but reason to be heard, and forming that reason well is the quiet labor of a serious life. Aquinas asked the hardest questions a human being can ask. We can still learn from how he answered them. Subscribe to continue. And if you want a practical starting point, the free Stoic Starter Kit in the description gives you everything you need to begin. All books referenced today are linked below.